A park ranger heard crying from a rock. What he saw when he broke it shocked everyone. John Mitchell had been a park ranger for over a decade, spending countless hours patrolling the vast, untouched beauty of the national park. He loved the tranquility that came with his job, the stillness of the forests, the crispness of the mountain air, and the feeling of being alone with nature. There was something soothing about the quietness that settled in the park after the park gates closed each night, knowing that everything was in its place. The world beyond the park's borders could be chaotic and noisy, but here it was peaceful. On one particular morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, casting a soft, golden glow over the towering trees and rugged terrain, John began his patrol with his usual routine. The sun was still low in the sky, casting long shadows on the path as he walked along the forest trail, occasionally checking the trees for any signs of damage or wildlife activity. The forest was always alive with sounds, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves in the wind, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. But that morning, something was different. As he moved deeper into the park, he heard something faint. At first, he thought it might just be the wind or maybe a trick of the forest. But then it happened again, an unmistakable sound. Crying. It was quiet at first, almost like a whisper on the breeze, but it grew louder and more distinct, echoing through the trees. John stopped in his tracks, his senses instantly alert. He looked around, scanning the surroundings for any sign of the source. The cry was faint, but it was undeniably human. It sounded like a child, though he wasn't sure. The sound came from somewhere deeper in the woods, where the trees thickened and the trail narrowed. Furrowing his brow, John hesitated. There were no children on this part of the park, at least not that he knew of. The park was vast and remote, a place where few people ventured unless they had a particular reason to. The sounds of distress coming from the wilderness weren't common. He wasn't sure whether to dismiss it or to investigate further, but curiosity got the best of him. He decided to follow the cries. He moved cautiously at first, carefully making his way through the dense underbrush, each step measured and deliberate. The cries seemed to come from a different direction now, pulling him further off the path. It was unnerving, the way the sound seemed to float on the air, almost guiding him through the trees, but also sending a chill up his spine. The further he ventured, the more he questioned what he was hearing. Was it really a cry for help? Or was it just the wind playing tricks on him? Despite his growing unease, John continued, driven by a sense of responsibility. If there was someone in need, he had to help. He wasn't the type of person to ignore someone's distress, even if it was just a strange noise in the woods. He pushed forward, parting branches and stepping over fallen logs, his eyes scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The sound led him to a large, jagged rock formation, rising up from the forest floor like an ancient sentinel. The cries were louder now, coming from deep within the rock itself. John's heart raced as he approached the base of the rock, his mind racing. He peered into the shadows between the boulders, expecting to see someone trapped or injured. But there was nothing, just the eerie sound of a human-like cry coming from somewhere inside. John frowned, his brow furrowing as he surveyed the area. The sound was unmistakably coming from within the rock, but there was no obvious way for someone to be inside. It was a strange and unnerving thought. How could someone be inside a rock? He stood for a moment, wondering if he might have been imagining it. But then the crying came again, louder and more frantic, and there was no doubt in his mind. He had to investigate. John took a deep breath and approached the rock formation carefully. It was an unusual shape, a large boulder with deep crevices and jagged edges, its surface smooth in some areas, rough in others. He knelt down, looking closely at the cracks, trying to determine where the sound was coming from. The closer he got, the clearer it became that the cries were emanating from somewhere within the rock itself. His instincts told him something was wrong, something wasn't adding up. But the sound, the desperation in the cries, made him push aside any doubt. Someone or something was in need of help. With no other option, John stood up and began to examine the rock more closely. It was too solid to have any openings, but the crying was undeniable. He could feel a sense of urgency stirring within him, a pull to uncover whatever secret the rock was hiding. He checked the ground around it, searching for any signs that could explain how someone had gotten trapped. There were no footprints, no disturbance in the dirt, nothing that could explain how someone had ended up here. It didn't make sense. His curiosity got the better of him, and he made up his mind. Whatever it was, he had to know. He wasn't one to shy away from a challenge, and this was no different. He grabbed his tool kit from his belt, carefully selecting a small hammer and chisel, tools he often used for repairing park signs and small tasks around the park. It wasn't a job he'd usually take on with such primitive tools, but he figured he could at least get a better look inside. John struck the surface of the rock gently at first, testing it to see if there was any give. The first few strikes made a dull sound, but the rock didn't break. His heart was pounding now, his senses heightened with anticipation and unease. He had no idea what he was about to uncover, but the cries grew louder, spurring him on. It felt as if the rock itself was almost alive, resonating with the cries as if it were part of the mystery. His hammer struck again, a little harder this time, and this time there was a small crack. Encouraged, John continued, each strike of the hammer sending vibrations through his arms. With each blow, the cries became more desperate, more frantic. John's chest tightened as the sound seemed to fill the air around him, and he couldn't help but feel as though the cries were calling to him, urging him to continue. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, a large section of the rock splintered away, revealing a hollow interior. John gasped. He had been expecting something, but what he saw was far beyond his wildest imagination. John's heart was racing in his chest as the rock finally gave way, revealing a hollow cavity inside. His mind was struggling to keep up with what his eyes were seeing. It was as though the world had slowed down. He could hardly believe it. Inside the rock, curled up in a ball, was a person. But this wasn't just any person. It was a young woman, her clothes torn and dirty, her body thin and fragile like she hadn't eaten in days. Her skin was pale, almost ghostly white, and her hair, dark and matted, fell across her face in tangled strands. She was lying in the hollow space of the rock, barely moving, her eyes wide and staring as if she had been trapped in this place for an eternity. For a moment, John stood frozen, staring at the woman in disbelief. The cries had stopped. All that remained was the eerie silence that hung in the air around them. The forest seemed to hold its breath as he kneeled down beside her, feeling a chill run down his spine. The woman didn't make any sound, not even a whisper. It was as though she had been waiting for someone to find her, but her body was too weak to react. John slowly reached out, his hands shaking slightly as he touched her arm, trying to rouse her. Her skin was cold to the touch, and it sent a wave of concern through him. He quickly glanced around, making sure he was still in the right place. The isolation of this area, the lack of any signs of recent human activity, was unsettling. He had no idea how this woman had ended up here, locked inside a rock like some kind of strange prison, but he couldn't leave her like this. He needed to help her. "Hey, are you okay?" John asked softly, his voice shaking with a mix of concern and disbelief. There was no answer. She didn't move. His mind raced. How had she gotten here, and why was she in such a state? John's thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of a bird calling out in the forest, but that only heightened the strangeness of the moment. It was as if the world outside the rock had completely faded, and only this woman and the strange circumstances surrounding her mattered. John gently lifted the woman into his arms, his instincts kicking in as he carefully carried her back toward his truck. The walk back felt much longer than it should have. He kept checking on her, making sure she was still breathing. Her chest rose and fell with each shallow breath, but she remained unconscious, her body limp and unresponsive. John's mind was filled with questions. How had she ended up in the rock? Was she lost, injured, or worse? He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the uncertainty of it all hanging in the air. The park had always been a place of quiet peace, but now, with this woman in his arms, it felt like he had stepped into an unknown world. He had spent years in this park, but this was something he had never seen before. John carefully placed the woman in the passenger seat of his truck, making sure she was as comfortable as possible. He didn't want to take any chances. He knew he needed to get her to help, and fast. As he climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, his mind was racing. What could have caused this? Who was she? And why had no one found her before? The drive back to the ranger station was long, and the silence in the truck was almost unbearable. The woman remained motionless, her face still pale and expressionless. John kept glancing over at her, trying to make sense of the situation. There was no sign of injury, no obvious wounds, but she was clearly malnourished and disoriented. Whatever had happened to her, it wasn't normal. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something much deeper at play. When they finally reached the ranger station, John didn't waste a moment. He rushed the woman inside, immediately calling for medical assistance. He explained what had happened, how he had found her trapped inside the rock, but the medical staff seemed just as confused as he was. They quickly got to work, checking her vital signs and trying to wake her from her unconscious state. But the woman didn't respond. It was as if she was lost in some kind of deep, unshakable sleep. The doctors and nurses ran tests, checking for dehydration and other signs of physical distress. They hooked her up to an IV and began to administer fluids, hoping it would help her regain some strength. But as the hours passed, she remained unresponsive. Her body was in a fragile state, and it seemed like she had been in the rock for much longer than anyone could imagine. John stayed by her side, watching as the medical team worked. His mind continued to churn with questions. He had never seen anything like this before. Who was she? How had she ended up in that rock? And why was she so weak, almost as though she had been hidden away from the world for a long time? As the night settled in, the medical staff decided to put her under observation, hoping that rest and the fluids would help her body heal. They instructed John to stay for a while, keeping an eye on her condition. But even after hours of waiting, the woman still hadn't opened her eyes or shown any signs of improvement. Feeling a mix of frustration and helplessness, John stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The night air was cool and the stars above were clear and bright. It was beautiful, just like the park always was. But tonight, it didn't feel the same. The park that he had known for so long suddenly felt different, as though it was hiding something. Something he couldn't quite understand. As he stood in the silence of the ranger station, John's mind kept circling back to the woman. Her pale face, her fragile body, the way she had been curled up inside that rock, it all seemed impossible. No one could have survived like that. Yet here she was, alive, and somehow he felt responsible for her now. He had found her, and now he had to figure out how to help her. He sighed deeply, staring out into the dark forest. The sound of crickets chirping in the distance was the only noise that filled the air. It was peaceful, but it didn't feel peaceful anymore. Something had changed. He could feel it deep in his bones. The park, once a sanctuary of quiet solitude, now felt like a place where mysteries were hidden, waiting to be uncovered. John wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't leave this woman in this state. There were too many questions, and he had a feeling that the answers were buried somewhere deep within the park. Somewhere that he had yet to discover. The next few days felt like a blur for John. His mind couldn't stop racing, constantly replaying the moment he found the woman in the rock and wondering how she could have ended up there. It was the kind of mystery that wouldn't let go, gnawing at him with every passing minute. But as the woman's condition started to improve, a new kind of worry began to surface. She was awake now, but she still didn't speak. She just lay in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, her eyes wide and distant, as if she were somewhere far away. It was like she was trapped in her own mind, unable to connect with the world around her. John had hoped that once she woke up, she would be able to explain what had happened to her. He had so many questions, too many questions. But every time he tried to talk to her, she didn't respond. Her lips never moved, and her eyes didn't show any sign of recognition. She was there physically, but mentally, it was like she was lost in a different world. Despite her silence, there were moments when John caught glimpses of something. Sometimes, when the woman's eyes would flicker, he would see a flash of fear, a hint of something that made him feel like she was trying to communicate something to him. It was subtle, like a quick glance in his direction or a slight shift in her posture when someone else entered the room. But it was never enough for him to fully understand what was going on in her mind. The doctors and nurses continued their work, trying to get the woman's body back to full health. They gave her food and water, and slowly she regained some strength. Her physical condition improved rapidly, but her mental state was still fragile. She didn't seem to recognize anyone, not even John, who had found her in the park. It was heartbreaking, watching her struggle in silence. John visited her every day, sitting by her bedside, hoping for any sign of progress. He talked to her even though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. He told her about the park, about the quiet mornings and the peaceful trails. He told her that she was safe now, that she didn't have to worry anymore. But still, there was no response. It felt like she was trapped in some sort of haze, unable to reach out or make any connection with the outside world. One afternoon, as John was sitting with her, watching her sleep, something unusual happened. The woman's eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in days she looked directly at him. There was no fear in her eyes, no confusion, just an empty, hollow look. It wasn't the same distant stare he had seen before. This time she seemed more alert, more present. It was as if she had heard something he had said, something that made her finally notice him. John felt his heart skip a beat. "You're awake," he said softly, almost as if he were afraid to disturb the fragile peace that had settled in the room. The woman's eyes flickered again, and for a moment he thought she might speak. But she didn't. Instead, she simply stared at him, her gaze piercing and unblinking. It was as if she was searching for something in his eyes, trying to understand who he was and why he was there. John's voice faltered, but he pressed on. "You're safe now. You've been through a lot, but you're going to be okay. You don't have to be afraid anymore." For a long moment, the woman said nothing. But then, in a voice so soft it was barely audible, she spoke. "The rock," she whispered, her words barely a breath. I was inside the rock." John leaned in closer, his heart pounding. This was the first time she had spoken since he found her, and the words sent a chill through him. "Inside the rock," he repeated, trying to make sense of what she meant. "How did you get there? What happened?" The woman's eyes glazed over for a moment, and John could see the fear in them again. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but no words came out. It was like she couldn't find the strength to say more. Her body trembled, and she turned her face away from him, staring out the window as though looking for something. John reached out gently, placing a hand on her arm. "It's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to talk if you're not ready, but we're here to help. Whatever happened to you, we'll figure it out together." For a brief moment, the woman's eyes met his again. This time there was a flicker of recognition, a spark that suggested she understood his words. But before she could speak again, a nurse entered the room, interrupting their moment. The woman immediately pulled back, retreating into herself once more, as if the brief connection had never happened. John stood up and stepped back, letting the nurse do her work. But inside, he was reeling. The woman had spoken. She had said something, but what did it mean? Why had she been inside the rock? And why had it taken so long for her to respond? Later that day, John sat in his office, poring over the woman's case file. The doctors had run several tests, trying to figure out what had caused her condition. Physically, she was improving, but mentally, it was clear she was still fragile. No one could explain how she had survived in such a condition, or why she had been so weak. The rock, the place where she had been trapped, had been a mystery. There were no signs of any entrances or exits in the rock. It was as if she had somehow appeared there, as if the rock had been her prison. John couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than anyone knew. The park had always been full of mysteries, but this was something different, something far more unusual. He couldn't help but feel that the woman's presence in the park, trapped in the rock, was tied to something deeper, something ancient that he couldn't understand. The more he thought about it, the more questions piled up. What was the woman's past? Why had she been hidden away for so long? And why had she ended up in the park of all places? John knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to stop until he found the answers. The park had always been his home, his sanctuary, but now it felt like it was hiding secrets, and he had to uncover them. He had to find out what had happened to this woman and why she had been locked away in that rock. It wasn't just a matter of curiosity anymore. It was a matter of duty. He had found her, and now he had to protect her, no matter what it took. The days following the woman's first real response passed slowly, each one filled with new hopes and new frustrations. John couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of discovering something monumental, something that could explain everything. The woman, whose name remained a mystery, had begun to show small signs of improvement, but she was still very much trapped in a state of confusion. Though her body was becoming stronger, her mind seemed to be locked in a cage, unable to break free. John continued to visit her every day, sitting by her bed, offering comfort even when she didn't seem to need it. He would talk to her softly, telling her about his life in the park, about the animals he had seen, and the quiet mornings he spent walking the trails. He didn't know if she could hear him, but he felt it was important to keep talking, to keep trying to reach her. Something told him that she was listening, even if she didn't respond. One afternoon, as John sat by her bedside, watching her stare out the window with a distant look in her eyes, the silence was broken by a soft sound. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it was there. A whisper. The woman's lips moved, almost imperceptibly, as if she were speaking to herself. John leaned in closer, his heart pounding with excitement. He didn't want to miss a single word. "What did you say?" he asked gently, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman's eyes flickered in his direction, and for the first time in days, a small, uncertain smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. It was fleeting, but it was there. And then, just as quickly, her gaze turned back toward the window, her expression growing distant once again. John's chest tightened. He was so close, yet it still felt like there was an invisible barrier between them. He had been hoping for more, for some kind of breakthrough, but the woman had once again retreated into herself. He wasn't sure what she was seeing when she looked out the window, but it seemed to pull her away from him. It was as if she were searching for something in the distance, something that only she could see. He continued to sit with her for hours, waiting for another sign, another clue that would help him understand what had happened to her. But as the day wore on, the room grew quieter, and the woman's silence became more oppressive. She didn't speak again, didn't move, didn't acknowledge his presence. It was as if the brief connection they had shared was a fleeting moment that had already slipped away. John couldn't help but feel a deep sense of helplessness. He had done everything he could, tried everything he knew to get through to her, but it seemed like no matter how hard he tried, the answers remained just out of reach. He felt as though they were both trapped, he in the uncertainty of not knowing the full story, and she in the prison of her own mind, unable to break free. The next morning, John arrived at the hospital early, as he always did. He knew he couldn't give up on her, no matter how difficult it had become. When he walked into the room, he noticed immediately that the woman's expression was different. She was sitting up in bed now, her posture more alert, her eyes focused on something in front of her. She wasn't staring off into space like she had been for days. She seemed more aware of her surroundings, more present. John's heart skipped a beat. Was this it? Was she finally coming back to herself? He stepped closer, trying to keep his voice calm and steady. "Hey there," he said softly. "How are you feeling today?" The woman's eyes flickered toward him, but she didn't speak. Instead, she gave a small nod, her expression still distant but less vacant than before. It was as if she were trying to find the right words, but something was holding her back. "Do you remember your name?" John asked, hoping to get some kind of reaction. She blinked, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though she was going to respond. But then she turned her gaze toward the window again, as if something outside was pulling her attention away from him. It was a subtle shift, but it was enough to make John's heart sink. She was still retreating into herself, still holding onto whatever memories or thoughts kept her from fully engaging with the world around her. "Please," John said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to be afraid. We're here to help you. You're safe now." For a moment it seemed as though she might say something, might break the silence with words of her own. But again, the woman said nothing. She simply stared out the window, her mind far away from the hospital room. John sat there in silence, his mind spinning with confusion and frustration. What had happened to her? How had she ended up in that rock? What was she running from? He couldn't understand why she wasn't willing to talk to him, why she refused to share the truth of what had happened. But just as he was about to leave for the day, something unexpected happened. The woman's hand moved, and for the first time in days, she reached out toward him. It was a small, tentative movement, but it was enough to make John's heart race with hope. He reached out to take her hand, careful not to startle her. Her skin was still cold, but there was a softness to her touch now, a sign that she was slowly coming back to life. As he held her hand, he noticed that her fingers were trembling slightly, and he could feel the faintest pulse in her veins. She was alive, really alive, and that gave him hope. "I'm here," John said softly, his voice steady. "You're not alone anymore." The woman's eyes slowly met his once again. There was a flicker of recognition in them, but it was fleeting, as though she wasn't sure if she should trust him yet. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. She closed her eyes as if the effort had drained her. John didn't want to push her. He knew that whatever had happened to her, it was something that would take time to process. She had been through something unimaginable, something that had left her scarred in ways he couldn't even begin to understand. But he wasn't going to give up on her. He couldn't. "I'll be here whenever you're ready," he said softly, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "Take your time." The woman didn't respond, but she didn't pull her hand away either. For the first time in days, John felt like he was making progress. Slowly, very slowly, she was starting to trust him, starting to let him in. It was a small step, but it was a step forward, and for John, that was enough for now. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was willing to walk it with her, no matter what it took. The following days felt like a delicate dance between hope and uncertainty. John found himself visiting the woman every day, watching as her condition continued to improve, though at a slow and sometimes frustrating pace. She was no longer trapped in the distant state she had been in when he first found her. There was a light in her eyes now, a flicker of recognition when he spoke to her, even if she didn't always respond. But each small improvement was a victory in John's eyes. It felt like progress, even if it was the smallest kind. The woman was still unable to speak much. She could barely whisper, but when she did, it was usually one word at a time. Sometimes she would give him a faint smile, acknowledging his presence, but she still seemed to be lost in a fog, trying to piece together the fragments of her memory. Her past was still a mystery, and though John was desperate to understand what had happened to her, he knew pushing her too hard would only make things worse. She needed time, and time was something he was willing to give her. One day, as John sat beside her bed, he noticed something different. The woman was no longer staring off into space. Instead, her eyes were focused, almost as if she were deep in thought. She was still so quiet, but there was an intensity in her gaze that made John feel like she was on the verge of something important. He leaned forward, careful not to startle her. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, his voice low and soft. The woman blinked slowly, as though she were coming back from a faraway place. She turned her head to look at him, her expression a mixture of uncertainty and something else, something that might have been fear, or perhaps it was confusion. Whatever it was, it made John's heart ache. He had spent so much time trying to help her, but it felt like there was still so much more to uncover. "I'm here," he said softly, trying to reassure her. "You're safe. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Her lips parted slightly, and for a moment John thought she might say something. Her eyes searched his face as though trying to find the words, but they were elusive, slipping through her mind like grains of sand. Then, without warning, she whispered, barely audible, "I was hidden." John's heart skipped a beat. She had spoken more than she had in days, and the words she chose were significant. "Hidden," he repeated, leaning in closer. "What do you mean? Who hid you? Why?" The woman's eyes flickered with a distant, haunted look. She turned her head away, her gaze drifting toward the window once again. The silence that followed was thick with the weight of unspoken truths, and John could see the woman's fingers tremble slightly as she clutched the edge of the blanket. It was as if whatever had happened to her was too much for her to face, too overwhelming to put into words. John knew he couldn't force her to talk. He had learned that much in the days he'd spent with her. But he couldn't shake the feeling that she was holding something back, something important that could explain everything. What had happened to her? How had she ended up trapped in that rock, and why had she been hidden away for so long? The answers were just beyond his reach, and it was maddening. "I know you're scared," John said softly, trying to comfort her. "But you don't have to keep it to yourself. Whatever happened, I'll help you, I promise." The woman's eyes shifted back to him, and for a fleeting moment, John thought he saw something change in her expression. A glimmer of trust, perhaps, or a recognition that she wasn't alone anymore. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by the same distant look she had worn for days. "I can't," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Too much." John felt a pang of sadness. He understood. She wasn't ready to talk about it, and he couldn't push her. But there was still something that nagged at him, something that felt wrong. Why had she been hidden? Who had done this to her, and why? The answers were buried deep within her, locked away behind the walls she had built in her mind. He had to be patient, but the waiting was the hardest part. Over the next few days, John continued to visit her, trying to provide as much comfort as he could. He noticed that she was becoming more aware of her surroundings, more present in the moment. She would glance around the room, taking in the details, as if she were trying to make sense of everything. Sometimes she would look at him, her eyes lingering on his face, but she didn't speak. And then one morning, something changed. John arrived at the hospital as usual, but when he entered the room, he noticed a difference in the woman. She was sitting up in bed, her posture more alert than before. Her eyes were no longer vacant, but sharp, focused. She was looking directly at him, and for the first time in days, there was a sense of recognition in her gaze. John's heart skipped a beat as he walked toward her. "Hey," he said softly, offering her a small smile. How are you feeling today? The woman didn't respond immediately. She just stared at him, her eyes searching his face, as if weighing whether or not she could trust him. It felt like an eternity before she spoke, her voice weak but clear. I remember, she said slowly, her words tentative. I remember where I was, I remember why I was hidden. John's breath caught in his throat. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment he had hoped for ever since he found her in that rock. What happened? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Please tell me what happened to you. The woman closed her eyes as though the memories were painful, too painful to bear. I was chosen, she whispered, chosen to protect something old. The rock was a prison to keep me safe. John's heart raced. This was more than he had expected. Chosen by who? Who made you stay there? The woman shook her head slowly. I can't remember. It was long ago. I was hidden away to keep the peace, to protect the secret, but it's broken now. I don't know why, but it's broken. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. John could feel the weight of them, the truth that had been hidden for so long, locked away in the woman's mind. She had been chosen for something important, and now it seemed like that thing had been disturbed, shattered. But what could it be? What secret had she been guarding? I'll help you, John said softly, reaching out to take her hand. Whatever it is, I'll help you figure it out. The woman's grip on his hand tightened slightly, a silent acknowledgement of his words. But even though she had finally spoken, even though she had begun to remember, there was still so much left unanswered. The mystery was far from over. Whatever had been hidden in the park, whatever she had been guarding, it was still out there. And John was determined to uncover the truth. John couldn't help but feel a surge of hope as the woman's words echoed in his mind. She had finally started to remember. She had spoken about being hidden, about protecting something old and valuable. But what could it be? And why had she been kept in that rock for so long? The questions were endless, and though John had made progress, he felt like he was still just scratching the surface of something far bigger than he could understand. The woman, who still hadn't told him her name, had become more responsive over the past few days. She was no longer as distant, no longer lost in the fog of confusion that had once surrounded her. But there was still so much she didn't say. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered all around them, but she hadn't put them together yet. John wasn't sure if it was something she was deliberately hiding, or if her memory had just been locked away so tightly that it couldn't be unlocked all at once. John decided to keep his focus on helping her recover. He made sure to be there every day, offering comfort and support. He talked to her about the park, about the beauty of the forest and the wildlife that roamed the trails. Slowly, she seemed to respond. She would nod or offer small smiles, little signs that she was starting to reconnect with the world around her. But even as she began to heal physically, John knew there was something else she was struggling with, a deep inner fear. It wasn't just the physical trauma of being trapped in the rock, it was something else, something hidden beneath the surface. John could see it in her eyes whenever she looked out the window, whenever she seemed to retreat into her own thoughts. There was a sadness there, a weight she carried that went far beyond her time spent locked in the rock. One afternoon, after a week of progress, the woman surprised John with something new. She spoke again, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was clearer, more confident. Her voice was still soft, but there was a strength in it that hadn't been there before. I remember something, she said, her eyes focused on him, as though she were trying to push through the haze that still clouded her mind. There's a place, a hidden place. It's in the park. John leaned in, his heart pounding with anticipation. What kind of place? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though inside, his excitement was growing. The woman's brow furrowed slightly as if the memory was just within her reach but too elusive to fully grasp. It's a secret place. I was supposed to protect it. I don't know what's there, but I remember it. The rock was meant to keep me close, to make sure nothing disturbed it. John's mind raced. A hidden place. It could be the key to everything. The secret she had been guarding, the reason she was locked away in the rock. It was all beginning to make sense, but there was still one crucial piece missing. What was this place? And why had she been chosen to protect it? Where is it? John asked urgently. Can you take me there? The woman's eyes filled with uncertainty. I don't know if I can. It's hidden so deep, but I feel like I have to go, like something is calling me back there. John stood up, pacing the small hospital room. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of something monumental. He had to know what this hidden place was. Whatever it was, it had been important enough to keep this woman trapped for so long. It had to be something that someone, or something, didn't want uncovered. "I'll help you," John said, his voice firm. "If you think you need to go back, I'll go with you. We'll find it together." The woman looked at him for a long moment, and John could see the internal struggle in her eyes. She wanted to trust him, wanted to believe that he could help, but there was a part of her that was still afraid. She had been trapped in the rock for so long, and now the idea of facing whatever lay ahead was terrifying. But there was something else, too, a sense of duty, as if she had no choice but to go back to the place she had been guarding all these years. Finally, after a long silence, the woman nodded. "I'll try," she said quietly, "but it's not going to be easy, the place. It's not like the rest of the park, it's different." John could feel the weight of her words. He didn't know what she meant, but he could tell that whatever was ahead, it wasn't going to be simple. There was a darkness surrounding it, an air of mystery that seemed to hang in the air whenever she spoke of it. But John had made a promise to her. He wasn't going to let her face this alone. The next morning, John prepared for their journey. He packed supplies, food, water, and a first aid kit, anything they might need if they were going into the more remote areas of the park. The woman had insisted on coming with him, though she was still weak, still not fully recovered. But he understood. She needed to face whatever it was that had been hidden away in the park, the thing that had been haunting her for so long. They set off early, leaving the hospital behind and heading into the forest. The park was just as beautiful as John had always remembered: tall trees, clear skies, and the sound of birds chirping in the distance. But there was a new tension in the air now, a feeling that something was about to change. The woman walked beside him, her steps slow but steady. She was still clearly exhausted, but there was a determination in her that John hadn't seen before. As they walked deeper into the forest, the trees began to grow thicker and the air grew cooler. The trail became less defined, and soon they were no longer on a marked path. John had spent years in this park, but this was a part of it he had never explored. The woman seemed to know the way, her gaze fixed on the ground ahead of them as if following an invisible trail. "We're getting close," she said quietly, her voice tinged with both fear and anticipation. John glanced at her, but he said nothing. They kept moving forward, following the sense of direction she seemed to have. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken thoughts and growing tension. John could feel his heart racing as they moved deeper into the woods. Whatever lay ahead, he could feel that it was important. The answers to the mystery of the woman's past, and perhaps the mystery of the park itself, were all hidden in this place. Eventually, they reached a clearing. The trees opened up to reveal a strange, almost unnatural sight. There in the center of the clearing was a large stone circle, weathered and covered in moss. It looked ancient, as though it had been here long before the park was even established. The woman stopped in her tracks, her eyes wide with recognition. "This is it," she whispered. "This is where I was supposed to be." John's heart raced as he took in the sight. The stone circle seemed to pulse with an energy he couldn't quite understand. There was something powerful here, something that went beyond the natural world. He could feel it in the air, a tension that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The woman stepped forward, her hands trembling. She seemed to be drawn to the center of the circle, her movements slow and deliberate. John followed, his curiosity getting the best of him. As they reached the center, the woman stopped and turned to face him. "I've been guarding this," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "But I don't know what it is. I only know that it must remain hidden. It's too dangerous if it's disturbed." John's mind was racing, trying to understand. What was this place? What was she protecting? And why had she been the one chosen to keep it hidden? Before he could ask, the ground beneath them began to shake, and a low rumble echoed through the clearing. The stone circle seemed to glow faintly, and the air around them grew thick with energy. Whatever was hidden here was waking up.